Okay. Representative Rabb, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to ask you about, the Commonwealth passed its budget a couple weeks ago. Can you walk us through how this budget can and will benefit Philadelphians?
Sure. With every budget, state budget, there are good things and bad things. And what's interesting as a legislator is, I think much in life, you can justify supporting or opposing things because it's so full of so many things. You can say, I'm supporting it because it has all these great things, despite all these awful things. You can also say, despite all these wonderful things, I'm opposing this measure or this budget or this bill because of the things that I strongly oppose. And so, yet again, we have a hodgepodge. And that's really indicative of the legislative process and the negotiating process between House Democrats and Republicans, the House and the Senate, and ultimately with the governor. So there's really 5 stakeholders, formal stakeholders, plus the general public across the Commonwealth. And so as a rank and file member, I am not a part of any of those negotiations. And in fact, this is the 6th budget where I find out essentially, the key components of that budget literally hours before voting for it. So it is often the case that I find out things that are in the budget from journalists and lobbyists before I figure it out myself, because these bills are so massive and so many things get shoved in the under the cloak of darkness. So all of that is a preamble to say that the things that I like that were put in the budget clearly relate to increased funding for Philadelphia public schools. It's a historic investment in public schools, and yet nearly enough. It's a lot, given that I work in a chamber and in a legislature that doesn't really support public school at all. So the fact that we were able to get, I believe, I forget the exact amount, but well over $100 million coming to Philadelphia schools is saying something relative to my experiences in my first 3 terms. But it's something that we certainly can use immediately, and we desperately need more money. Of course, that's going to be up to voters in November and in each successive election with regard to the type of people they want to send to Harrisburg who will actually support full and fair funding of public education.
And you said something there that is concerning, though, regarding process. And we do like to talk about process. But when you get the budget just before you're supposed to vote on it, you can make the argument the budget's the most important vote you could take that year, because it's highlighting all the different priorities that the government's taking. Why is it that way? And is there any way to change that?
So the last question is the easiest to answer, and that is yes, we can change it. That requires the political will of the general population, voters and non-voters, people who have chosen not to vote or who cannot vote, either because they're not old enough or they're not eligible to vote or they have not found a reason to register in the first place, to say, I don't like how we're getting stuff done with our taxpayer dollars, because even children and non-voters pay taxes. Unless and until they understand that the way we've done it for decades and generations is not particularly democratic or good for the Commonwealth, then this will continue. And there are many things that have happened behind closed doors that once people discover is happening behind closed doors, they say, this shouldn't happen behind closed doors. But that's why independent media outlets like yours and others have so much work to do to raise the level of awareness and transparency around how things currently happen, and then leave it to the public to decide, is this good? Is this appropriate? Does this move us forward as a commonwealth, as a city, as a society? And we can see that that's happened in the aftermath of the nonviolent protests stemming from the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. People were seeing the importance of police accountability when they discovered so many things were happening unbeknownst to them that were negatively impacting community safety, black and brown people in particular. And that's when they said, okay, we need to have greater transparency and accountability in law enforcement. And that echoed in Harrisburg, and me and a handful of other black legislators literally shut down, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and demanded immediate legislative action on police accountability. And 36 days later, Governor Wolf signed 2 Democratic bills into law with unanimous support in the House and the Senate. That happened because people exercised their First Amendment rights, protested in 66 of 67 counties, and I don't know the one county where there weren't any documented protests, but that's saying a lot. In Pennsylvania, where only 14% of the population is black, and there were all-white protests against racial violence and racial injustice, and we were able to get something done that had never been done before, create a police misconduct database, which was just in the news because a local law enforcement agency and township refused to follow the law and didn't do a background check, and it indirectly allowed for a child killer to get offered a job in a small town in Pennsylvania, and then he had to resign when the people found out what happened.
That's right.
All of this is to say that if once people realize what the process is and they see how hierarchical and inefficient and inequitable it is, and what that means in terms of how that may hurt the ability of legislators to do what they want them to do, something will change. But unless and until that knowledge is gained, it will continue on.
Where do you think the Commonwealth needs to make more investment in terms of anti-poverty funding and anti-violence funding?
Great questions. Well, on the anti-poverty front, like we have a serious housing crisis. We have a housing crisis among those folks who are homeowners who can barely afford the cost of home ownership, folks on fixed incomes who have homes in great disrepair. And then you have folks who are renters who can't afford the rent. And then you have folks who want to be first-time home buyers who can't afford it. This is an issue, and the irony is in Harrisburg, there's no housing committee. When I got elected in 2016, I took office in 2017, I wanted to be on the housing committee, and they're like, there is no housing committee. Like, that is a basic, like, food, shelter, clothing, shelter. There's no housing committee, which speaks volumes about the priorities of the folks who have run Harrisburg for the past 30 years, and those are my Republican counterparts. And while I don't particularly see myself as a partisan, the facts are the facts. Republicans have run Harrisburg for the vast majority of the past 30 years due to gerrymandering, and as a result, the infrastructure of Harrisburg and how it operates is I was saying that the operational architecture of Harrisburg is influenced by those folks who have been in the multi-generational majority of the House and the Senate. And so what we're able to do has a lot to do with the very rules and culture of Harrisburg. That is what I was thrust into when I was elected. And as a result, who gets on what committees? What are the committees? Who runs those committees? What bills are even considered that address the the concerns of a majority, irrespective of political party, of Pennsylvanians. All that is decided by the people who run the one party in control. So garbage in, garbage out. You have to look at the architecture of how things get done. You can do the same thing for City Hall. You can do the same thing for Congress. But for those of us who live in Philly or anywhere else across the Commonwealth, on a state level, you have to understand kind of the math and politics of that institution. And that institution has been very anti-Philadephia for a long time.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on Philadephia Hall Monitor.
Hi, and thank you for joining us, Representative Rabb. I kind of wanted to ask a couple of questions about some amendments that came down the pike as part of the budget process, particularly amendments that there were three that seemed to stand out. One was, of course, the amendment on abortion rights, but the other two regarded voting.
Are you referring to the late night resolution passed by Republican senators?
Yes.
To get a ballot question to amend the state constitution to do a number of things, inclusive of the things you just mentioned?
Yes.
Okay. So that would be a vote on the prospective amendment of the state constitution, but what was put forth in terms of a vote were not amendments, they were a vote on a resolution to amend the state constitution. Yes.
First of all, what is the difference between the two things for those of us who may not know that there's a difference? And secondly, when you were presented with these things, what did you think, especially in light of the fact that the budget itself had either not been passed or had just been passed that day?
I thought this is just another day in Harrisburg. If people had any idea just how that's crazy, and that's a quote, the norm is the toxic work environment in which legislators are sent, particularly legislators who do not have the benefit of being in the majority, which is what controls the legislative agenda. I don't mean that in any other sense other than practically speaking. Only the majority can decide what bills are run. So that is the norm. They have been putting up anti-repro justice bills for the past 3 terms that I've been in office. They have put up anti-trans bills, anti-immigrant bills, anti-black bills. This is the norm. So there's nothing that they can do that will surprise me. My only hope is that for the folks who are not already focused or angry enough about this because they have found out about this one way or the other, that if this is new information that is enraging, that people will positively convert that rage into collective action when it matters most. And it's not just during election season, because that's important. Voting is important, but not everyone can vote. And oftentimes, when people do vote, there's only one name on the ballot. So our democracy has to transcend the election cycle. We also have to protest. We have to demand change. And people say, oh, well, these marches don't work. There's no evidence that marches don't work. And I can prove that because as a black person, many of the things that I have now would not have happened if they were not for nonviolent protests for generations that led to actual concrete legislation. And I also referenced it previously in my own work, helping lead a protest that led to a historic change in how we view law enforcement as codified in state law by creating a police misconduct database. So I think that this extreme resolution that would seek to amend the state constitution to essentially ban abortion and to reinstate voter ID and other things is emblematic of the true priorities of my Republican colleagues, because this is what they do all year long. they were trying to find a moment with less scrutiny, past 11 o'clock, which was a rule that was changed years ago to avoid this very thing, where legislators couldn't pass something late at night and people wouldn't find out. That it literally caused a sea change in representation in Harrisburg, when a number of people didn't get reelected because they voted for a pay raise for themselves, in the wee hours, hoping that it wouldn't catch a lot of people's attention, and it ultimately backfired on them. And that's exactly what Republicans did 2 weeks ago. And it's part of a larger plan. But this plan is not particularly secret, because this has been their legislative priority for years.
So if I'm a voter in Pennsylvania and I'm listening to this process go on, what can I do as a voter to make it so these things don't pass? What kind of information should I be looking for?
Well, here's the thing. If you're in Philadelphia, there wasn't a single Philadelphia legislator that supported it. So this is bigger than voting, because the one person who was part of this is a state senator named Doug Mastriano, and he's running for governor. So if you're a Philadelphia voter and you don't like the process by which it happened, you don't like the end result of this motion being made for a resolution that would amend the Constitution in the most brutal ways, then you should definitely figure out who is the gubernatorial candidate, who is in most alignment with your values. Now, there's no perfect candidate. There's no perfect party. There's no perfect campaign. But if this is a concern of yours, if reproductive justice is a concern of yours, well, then, it should be a pretty easy decision. Now, I'm using a government phone, so I can't really get into candidates, campaigns, endorsements, etc. But I can say that on that issue, the two gubernatorial candidates could not be further apart. But it doesn't matter what you feel; it matters how you express that feeling at the ballot box. And most people who are adults who are of voting age don't actually vote.
Uh-huh.
But they need the information. They also need to understand the process. Normally they just find out the results. But if they understand that it's garbage in, garbage out, and that the whole system is deeply problematic, then they can ask themselves, well, who are the folks who actually want to talk about root causes and systemic change? And then they can figure out who among the political party they identify with are folks who are committed to that and who are less inclined to talk about systemic change. But the day after the Dobbs decision came out, and I'm sure you know this, at City Hall, 5,000 to 10,000 people came out, many of whom were young folks. I imagine some were even too young to vote. They were mad as hell. The following day, Democrats organized something, and 100 people showed up about the same issue, just 24 hours later. This issue transcends campaigns, elections, candidates, and political parties. And more legislators need to understand that, because there weren't that many elected officials, very few, who actually showed up when the 5,000 people showed up. And perhaps more elected officials need to have their ear closer to the ground to understand the complicated feelings that voters and non-voters alike have around these important issues that you raised.
Okay. So, Larry, do you have any additional questions?
Yeah, I just have two that are kind of Philadelphia-centric, but also kind of the first one ties with Harrisburg. We've seen House Republicans begin this nascent impeachment process against District Attorney Larry Krasner. Particularly strange because he was just reelected with over 80% of the vote in the city. But where do you come down on this? What are your thoughts on this process? And is this just a political ploy?
It is absolutely a political ploy, part out of desperation, part out of a deep disregard for Philadelphians. Mm-hmm. These are folks who talk about liberty and justice for all. They stand for the Pledge of Allegiance every day. They talk about the First Amendment. They talk about voting. They talk about all these things. But somehow, when the vast majority of voters double down and choose to reelect their district attorney, that's immaterial. That's irrelevant. They're not saying that it was voter fraud and that he wasn't actually reelected by a wide margin. They just don't care. Now, part of that, they don't have the courage to say out loud, which is, we don't trust black people because there's a black plurality in the city. And ultimately, they don't trust or care for the collective opinions and concerns of black people. They're not going to say that because they don't want to look racist. But the reality is their policy priorities and their policy proposals are racist. And that's something that I prefer people in hoods, because you know where they stand. And they'll say what they mean and mean what they say. You know who you're dealing with. For folks who like to play politics in this day and age, they like to do gaslight and dog whistle and use buzzwords. For anyone who's been around, and I'm 52, there's nothing new under the sun, and it's not particularly subtle. But no one wants to be called a racist, even folks who do racist things. And this is an indictment of democracy. It's an indictment of, or the anti-democratic feelings of folks who don't really want democracy. That's not really what they're promoting. They're promoting the freedom to do whatever the hell they want because they have the power to do so. And we give them the power when we don't organize. We give them the power when we don't vote as consistently or as intentionally as we should. And when we don't push back against racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, transphobic, homophobic things that are on their agenda every single day. So we have a part to play in the success of their efforts. And when we are silent, when we equivocate, they win. But there's no good reason for this. When I spoke on the House floor, I said, we already have a legislative body that holds the district attorney's office and every other elected official to account, and that's the city council. We have a committee on public safety that can hold the district attorney to account if indeed the people of Philadelphia feel that he is not doing what he should do in his office. And Larry Krasner is not universally loved. There is no elected official I know of ever that is universally loved. And there are people who have strong opinions on different parts of the work that he does, his office does. And if there was a concern, that concern can be brought up by the appropriate legislative body. They want to create a select committee of non-Philadelphians, non-black people, non-Republicans, or non-Democrats to decide what's the priority for investigations for a Philadelphia-specific position. And that is about as anti-democratic as I can imagine.
Right. And you brought up city council. So after the Parkway incident on the 4th of July, city council held a press conference in council chambers, and the term stop and frisk came up. What was your reaction when you heard that, and what do you think is meant by that?
I mean, what do I think about stop and frisk, or what do I think about the intentions of people who brought it up?
I guess both, because it was mentioned, and it to me, and this is the word I kept using over and over again that week, everything that happened that week was just odd. And I think it was an odd thing that it was sort of brought up, and I was just wondering what you thought when you heard that, and if that's something that is worth exploring. Is it something to be dismissed out of hand?
No, I mean, I am adamantly opposed to stop and frisk. I am a black man in a racist society. I would be subject to stop and frisk if I weren't wearing a suit, maybe even wearing a suit.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm wearing a hoodie, there's a good chance I'm going to be stopped, and I could be stopped with force. I could be stopped, and it could be psychologically traumatizing to me, as it is to the vast majority of largely black men and boys. It is the discretion of law enforcement to decide who they stop and frisk. And law enforcement has not earned the trust of black people to decide who is worthy of stopping and frisking and who is not. I represent Chestnut Hill, which is one of the richest neighborhoods in the entire state. Do you think they're going to be stopping white men, 18 to 35? No. And if they did, whoever stopped them would be fired summarily if they stopped the wrong rich white person. We know this. If they stop everyone equally, irrespective of race or gender, but then what would be the point, right? It is tantamount to racial profiling, which is why stop and frisk doesn't work, because racial profiling doesn't work, and it has an extraordinarily negative consequence of traumatizing black and brown people. Right? If you really believed in racially profiling, and it wasn't just racist, then you would stop every young white man with blonde hair and blue eyes because they look like Timothy McVeigh.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, when you're looking at terrorist threats, you'd be stopping white people every single day, every minute. But that's not happening because of racism.
Yeah.
Because the face of violent crime in this country, because of media and other institutions, mainstream media and other institutions, is the face of a black man.
Yes.
That's why stop and frisk can never work.
That's right. Well, Representative Rabb, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And I look forward to hearing this in 2 days.
Okay.
In 2 days.
Okay.
In 2 days.